Hello everybody, a very good morning to you. It's 7 o'clock. You're very welcome to join us wherever you're watching us right around the world this morning. An unsettled outlook home and away. We'll have the latest as Storm Dudley bears down across Scotland and northern England. Meanwhile, the US forecasts the tensions are far from over. It's casting doubt on Russian claims of a troop withdrawal from the Ukraine border. In a moment, we'll speak to the chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. He's in Kiev. Plus, the Armed Forces Minister, James Heapy. He joins us after 8 o'clock. It's Thursday, the 17th of February.
Thousands wake up without power and face travel disruption in the north of England and in Scotland after Storm Dudley pummeled the UK. And there's more bad weather to come.
No withdrawal. The US says Russia's added several thousand troops along Ukraine's border, despite claims it was pulling back some soldiers.
The Foreign Secretary warns Russia could draw out the crisis for months ahead of a visit to Ukraine and to other European allies.
I'm in Brussels, where defence ministers are planning their next move as a standoff with Moscow continues.
Hospitals, overwhelmed coronavirus patients are treated outdoors as Hong Kong faces record infections despite a zero COVID policy. Deliver some justice. A group of cross-party MPs demand fair compensation for the victims of the post office scandal. Terror in the tide. Sydney's beaches are closed and people are ordered to stay out of the water after the city's first fatal shark attack in almost 60 years. Also coming up on the programme for you this morning, the end of an era. One of the UK's oldest zoos is set to shut for good. We'll speak to Bristol Zoo about why it's closing and how it'll keep the animal magic alive. And just the ticket, we'll speak to a hero bus driver and the passenger whose life he saved. Good morning, everybody. Storm Eunice has packed a punch with strong winds and heavy rain overnight, causing power cuts and travel disruption across large parts of Scotland and northern England. Northern Power Grid says more than 14,000 homes lost electricity, with 4,000 yet to be reconnected in parts of Yorkshire, Lancashire, Cumbria and in the northeast. 42 flood alerts are in place, mostly clustered around Yorkshire, the Welsh borders and the Midlands. And there's a major disruption on the railways, including all services in Scotland, where it could be midday before trains start running on some routes. Standing by for Fraser this morning. Hi, Fraser. I think you're in York this morning, aren't you? How's it going there?
Good morning, Kay. I am in York. Yeah, I'm in Clifton, next to the River Ouse, which is one of the places where these 42 flood alerts are in place at the moment. 2 flood warnings in place over in Cumbria as well. And it feels as though we're in the calm between the storms. It was really windy this morning, a couple of hours ago. Those winds have died down now as Storm Dudley finally passes away. But we're waiting for Storm Eunice to come in tonight. Overnight, we saw winds of over 80 miles an hour, 81 miles an hour in North Wales, over 70 miles an hour in West Yorkshire, causing serious disruption and power outages as well. We saw huge power outages, problems with Storm Arwen, didn't we, a few weeks ago, with tens of thousands of homes losing their power. But if we look at the Northern Power Grid interactive map of where is without power at the moment, few dotted red areas, sparsely dotted around the north of England. 10,000 homes had their power restored overnight, still 4,000 without their power. But if you looked at that map last night, it was a sea of red. There was, in fact, a waiting system in place on the website. You had to wait in a queue to be allowed to let onto the website, and then you were only allowed 10 minutes to view the local flood situation or the local power outage situation in your area before you were booted out. But clearly they've been working hard, Northern Power Grid. They've got most of those homes back on. They're not sure yet how long it'll take to get those 4,000 homes that are still without power back on the grid again. And of course, as you mentioned, severe travel disruption as well. If we look up in Scotland, ScotRail decided to suspend most of their services from 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon when we saw lots of trees on the line and so on. More travel disruption coming later later on tomorrow as well. People from who've got tickets on the London North East Railway saying that they can use their tickets today rather than tomorrow. Bracing ourselves for Storm Eunice, 100-mile-an-hour winds, preparing for the worst and hoping for the best, as always in these situations.
Indeed, Fraser, thank you. In other news, the United States has accused Russia of adding as many as 7,000 troops along the Ukraine border in recent days. That's despite claims by President Putin that troops are being pulled back from the region. Western estimates suggest Russia has massed about 150,000 troops around Ukraine. Satellite images taken over the last 48 hours show military forces deployed along Ukraine's border in Belarus, in Crimea and Western Russia. A new military pontoon bridge, an attack helicopter unit and artillery are among the elements visible in the photographs. Let's just take you through the latest developments in the crisis, should we? Here we go. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss will visit Ukraine's capital, Kiev, in the coming days. She's expected to make a speech warning Vladimir Putin that an invasion would bring severe economic sanctions. Ukraine's president has tweeted his appreciation for the UK's support and thanked Boris Johnson for showing unity with Ukraine. Elsewhere, NATO defence ministers are meeting in Brussels for a second day of talks in an effort to avoid war. And Ukraine has asked the UN Security Council to discuss a bid by Russia's parliament to recognise self-proclaimed separatists when they meet later on today. Let's take you to Kiev. Should we? Standing by to speak to us this morning is the chair of the Defence Select Committee and former Defence Minister, of course, Tobias Ellwood. Mr. Ellwood, thank you for joining us on the programme this morning. What are you hoping to achieve with your visit?
Well, firstly, you get a flavour just how serious the situation is. There's absolutely a real threat from Russia across the border. That hasn't dissipated, as you were just outlining, but there's also a huge recognition and appreciation for the support coming from Britain. That's very, very obvious indeed. But the penny is dropping too, that Ukraine is at the epicentre, if you like, of the clash between Western liberalism and authoritarianism. There's a much bigger picture at play, which I think the West is now beginning to appreciate. And if we blink, where could this take us? It's too late to bring in a NATO division, as I called for. I recognise that. But the West, I think, needs to ask themselves, what more can we do? Perhaps look at a no-fly zone. Certainly, defence spending will have to increase as the world does get more dangerous. But it's this bigger alliance between Russia and China. It's through that prism that we need to look at events here in Ukraine.
Did want to, I know that you are quite close with Lord Dannatt. You've been speaking to him quite a lot over the last few days. Given that you brought up the troops there, I just wanted to play this grab to you from what he said to us earlier on in the week and see where that puts us now. Here we go.
I shouldn't smile. You're not the first person to ask me about Tobias Ellwood. Actually, I rang Tobias about 20 minutes ago and said, come on, old chap, what are you getting on about?
And that was when we were talking, of course, about troops on the ground in Ukraine and particularly around Kiev, the capital. What would you say in response to him?
Well, we did have a conversation and we're actually saying the same thing. It's far too late. I was calling for this months and months ago when the build-up of troops, of Russian troops, was evident. There's a process that has to be followed. We need to take the British people with us to recognise that, yes, this is a high-risk strategy, but ultimately it would prevent an invasion. You're not starting a war, you're actually preventing a Russian attack, and that must be a good thing. NATO is all about European security, and Ukraine is part of Europe. The consequences of not doing anything, allowing that invasion to actually take place, will have massive implications for the UK economy. Oil, gas, food prices will go up. But like I said, there's a bigger picture at play at where Russia is going. Its alliance with China is a turning point, if you like, in our security on the international stage. And I think privately, the international community is regretting not stepping forward. But we still can act. We still can offer a no-fly zone. And critically, this initiative that Britain has put forward, the last time the Prime Minister was here, this alliance between Poland, Ukraine and Britain is something that's very, very important indeed. That needs to be explored as to how we can support the Ukrainian people. If we do nothing and allow an invasion to take place, it will have, I think, a totemic effect on European security. This is a serious moment and we're being tested.
Lord Dannett also said that we shouldn't allow Ukraine to join NATO. The German Chancellor Scholz, who was in Moscow, as you know, speaking to President Putin this week, he seemed to hint at that as well. Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, we need to get over this idea that we hide behind the excuse that because a nation is not in NATO, that they don't deserve some form of serious support. Libya, for example, Kosovo, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, these are all places that we went in as NATO capability, but they're not members of NATO, but there were security concerns here. So we need to stop hiding behind this. The West has become too risk-averse over the months, indeed the years itself. I'd even call for a Casablanca-type conference, if you like, because you've got Berlin, Paris, London and Washington still looking in slightly different directions, and that's being exploited by Putin in Moscow.
What's a Casablanca conference?
Well, this happened during the Second World War. It was before you even decided what you wanted to do. You made sure that the home team was pointing in the same direction. So, yes, we've threatened the sanctions, but if you understand the bigger picture, if Putin is wanting to realign his country with China, sanctions will only help him persuade the Russian people, look, our future is not with the West, it's actually with China. We don't need that Nord Stream 2 going across to Western Europe. We can have 3 of those with China. And, of course, they have scant regard for human rights issues and so on, an equal disdain for the West. And that alliance, as I say, I can't be stronger in what my concerns here. That new alliance will have a massive implication for geopolitical security over the next few decades.
There was a day of unity yesterday in Ukraine and Kiev, particularly some concerns that yesterday was going to be the day that there was an incursion and an invasion. That didn't happen, thankfully. But what's the mood there like? As an outsider, as a Westerner, if you will, what are you picking up?
Well, when you first come here, you can feel the tension. There's no doubt about it. The threat is very, very real indeed. But there's a stoic sense of determination here. Don't forget, the people here have been living with this for years and years and years with the war going on. But a crisis, could break out at any moment, and contingency plans are in place. There is an absolute worry. And I think privately there is a desire to, call for the West to do more. This is their moment of need. And at the moment, the West is not doing enough.
And doing more looks like what?
Well, like I said, initially a no-fly zone would be very, very helpful indeed. That is something I hope that could be explored at the Munich Security Conference. Certainly, as each day goes by and an invasion doesn't take place, we should be absolutely supporting Ukraine. As I say, that bond between Poland, Ukraine and Britain is something that absolutely wants to be explored. That's something that you can ask James Heapy about. That alliance there could be the genesis of, and include the Baltics as well, of a new strength of support, of security in Eastern Europe. But I stress, this is the bigger picture taking place here. It's not just about Ukraine. This is about global security and where our world goes to, as our international rules-based order will be reinterpreted by Russia and China if they form this axis over the coming months and years.
But you are stepping back now, are you, Mr. Ellwood, from UK boots on the ground?
I made that very clear, that was an option. That option has departed. We simply cannot do that. When I first raised this at the end of last year, yes, and speaking to senior military leaders both in Britain and the United States, absolutely it could have happened. It would have taken 5 days to actually mobilise those forces at the request of Ukraine. This is what they actually wanted to. But we blinked. We didn't appreciate that full picture. We didn't have the situational awareness to say, my goodness, this is not just about Ukraine. There's something else going on here. The West is now appreciating that. There's no doubt about it. But I worry that it still isn't fully understood. Like I said, any sanctions that are imposed on to Russia, they will retaliate, and it will give Putin the excuse to pivot his country away from the West towards an alliance with China.
Mr. Ellwood, it's good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll also be hearing the thoughts of the government this morning, as Tobias Ellwood hinted there, speaking to the Armed Forces Minister James Heapy at around 8:10. Liz Truss is heading to Ukraine this week to deliver a speech warning President Putin against invasion. In a moment, we'll speak to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's in Kiev. But first to Ali, who is standing by in Brussels, where NATO defence ministers are meeting and have been for several days, haven't they? Ali, what have they achieved?
Morning, Kay. Well, they've set out a potential plan to change their posturing, their military posturing, so the presence of troops in parts of Eastern Europe, which would be significant. It's not set in stone yet, but that was the significant announcement that came yesterday evening. And this is day 2, and a particularly significant day because it is a day that the Ukrainian Defence Secretary is going to be here in Brussels meeting those 30 NATO members. This is a routine meeting. It happens every 6 months, but it is one that has forced NATO for the first time in a long time to really focus on their own defence and their own deterrence. And I think the big question is, how long can this go on for? How long can this really be drawn out, this long protracted standoff? And we heard some about that yesterday from Jens Stoltenberg, talking about a new normal, the new normal being this constant threat from Russia. And he talked about the potential for battle groups moving eastwards. He said that France had already indicated they would be willing to host a battle group in Romania, but we wait to see if that will actually happen. Military commanders are going to be looking at it. Clearly, that is the opposite of what President Putin wants. He says his security concern is the expansion of NATO eastwards, but Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General, says that this is defensive and that they are still listening to Russia's security concerns and that they want diplomacy to work.
OK, Ali, thank you. Deborah standing by for us in Kiev, where we saw the chair of the Defence Committee just a few moments ago. Hello to you, Deborah. Listening to Tobias Ellwood there, you can feel his frustration at the fact that the West have not done enough quickly enough.
Yes, although there's been, there's this balancing act that NATO allies have been trying to perform between defending themselves, helping to deter an attack on Ukraine, and not being seen to be provocative, to give President Putin an excuse to be able to say, well, look, these allies, this NATO alliance is a threat to me, which is what he is saying. But if you actually saw NATO troops here in Ukraine, yes, it would definitely increase the deterrence effect. Yes, it would enhance Ukraine's ability significantly to defend itself. But it would take you one step closer to a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. And goodness knows where that would end up. And you could imagine, and clearly Tobias Ellwood believes this is the case, that were the West to make such a move and to put its forces in this country willing and ready to take that risk of a direct confrontation with Russia, that would be enough to make President Putin blink. But what if he didn't? If he didn't, then the results, the ramifications of that really do, and I don't want to use this word glibly, really do sort of take the entire world closer to a new world, to the Third World War, which is clearly what everybody is trying ultimately to prevent. It's really difficult, but what is true is that the steps that allies have taken so far in terms of laying out the kinds of sanctions that they would impose on President Putin, the bolstering of NATO forces along its eastern flank, clearly hasn't been enough to make President Putin think twice. And that's very clear by the fact that you've got this so-called drawdown of Russian forces actually looking more like a draw up. OK, thank you. Thanks a lot. Still to come on the programme for you this morning, with yet another round of university strikes underway. We speak to the head of the University and College Union and one of the thousands of students that have been impacted. Also speaking to the Shadow International Trade Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds, coming up. And then later, speaking to Mark Voyager, a former advisor whose knowledge of Russia helped him advise both the US Army and NATO. Broad mix of stories on the front pages for you this morning. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss writes for The Telegraph, suggesting Russian President Vladimir Putin will deliberately prolong the conflict in Ukraine in an attempt to test the mettle of the West.
Financial Times reports that France is calling for an overhaul of EU security protocols to counter the threat of Russia. The Guardian leads with the news that all children aged 5 to 11 will be offered a COVID jab, and has a dramatic picture of Storm Dudley hitting the coast. The Metro reports on what it calls another royal scandal, the police investigation into allegations of cash for honours at one of Prince Charles's charities. Teachers are being given new guidance on remaining politically impartial in the classroom and not to promote movements like Black Lives Matter. Madeline is joining us now from the newsroom with the timetable. Hello to you, Madeline. Tell us more about this story.
This new Department for Education guidance is not what it says about preventing topics being discussed or taught in the classroom. It's about reminding teachers to do it with impartiality. An example it gives is when teaching about racism, not to promote the organisation Black Lives Matter, or saving discussions about the sometimes complex legacy of historical figures involved in the empire for older pupils. This is what the Education Secretary Nadhim Zahawi said. I don't want there to be any barriers, real or perceived, to teachers' vital work in this space, which is why I'm reinforcing that no subject is off limits in the classroom, as long as it is treated in an age-appropriate way with sensitivity and respect, and without promoting contested theories as fact. Now, it's important to note that is already illegal. This is not a new law. It's been illegal for decades to promote political theory or partisan views in the classroom, and unions point that out and say this is what they're already doing. This new guidance just makes things more complicated, more complex for them, and risks stifling engagement in the classroom with pupils.
OK, thanks, Madeline. A group of cross-party MPs is calling for post office workers who were falsely accused of fraud to be fully compensated. More than 700 people who ran post offices were wrongfully prosecuted because of a computing error. It's been described as one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in British legal history. Here's Katie Barnfield.
Hundreds of lives destroyed. The post office staff wrongly convicted for theft and false accounting, lost jobs, went to jail, became bankrupt. Now a group of cross-party MPs has criticised the way the government is handling compensation for these victims, caught up in one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in British history.
Our report today is calling for full, fair and final compensation for every victim of the Post Office Horizon scandal. Now, ministers in the Post Office have said that they agree, but at the moment, the Chancellor hasn't signed the cheque to pay the bill, and the schemes are not open to all of the victims who need access.
More than 700 post office staff were wrongly prosecuted after errors in a computer system called Horizon showed up cash shortfalls that didn't exist. After they were accused, some took their own lives. Others spent years trying to pay back money they never owed.
The report is particularly critical of the compensation paid to the group of 555 sub-postmasters who originally brought this case to court. Because of legal fees, they've lost out on a huge proportion of the damages they've been awarded. The committee say the government should cover those costs.
Chris Head was one of those 555. His life ruined when he was accused of stealing more than £88,000 from his branch in West Bolden.
We're not asking for anything that we're not entitled to. We're not asking for them to give us something that's not deserved. We're asking to be put back into the financial position we would have been in had we not encountered the Horizon scandal at all.
The inquiry into the scandal continues this week, and while the government haven't yet announced further compensation, they say they are keen for all the issues surrounding it to be resolved. Katie Barnfield, Sky News.
Talking about that in more detail later on the programme. Also making news for you this hour, Germany has announced plans to end most of the country's coronavirus restrictions by the 20th of March. With new infections falling, a three-step plan to start easing rules was endorsed by the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. Almost 6 million children in the UK aged 5 to 11 are to be offered COVID vaccinations. The government's Vaccine Advisory Committee says children should be offered a low dose on a non-urgent basis, with the rollout in England expected to start in April. A study published in the British Medical Journal has concluded that people who catch COVID-19 are more likely to develop depression and anxiety. Researchers compared data for more than 150,000 people who had experienced symptoms with more than 500,000 who had not. A coalition of 18 health charities is calling on the government to continue to provide free COVID tests for everybody. There's some speculation that the government's Living with COVID strategy for England will lead to an end to free PCR and lateral flow tests. Hong Kong's zero COVID strategy is being put to the test. Hospitals are overwhelmed following record infection numbers, leaving some patients to be treated on trolleys in car parks in the open air. Our Asia correspondent Tom Cheshire has this report.
2 years into the pandemic, what's happening in Hong Kong looks more like the first 2 months. Patients wheeled out onto the street as hospital capacity is overwhelmed. The city's dynamic zero COVID strategy is failing, and it's bracing for the worst.
As far as Hong Kong is concerned, we need to find our own way out of this epidemic. It has outgrown our capacity.
Hong Kong has been closed off from the world since the start of the pandemic. It had done well as a result, recording just over 200 deaths, with a series of partial lockdowns and restrictions on gatherings. The city bought itself time, but it did not spend it well ahead of Omicron's arrival. The vaccination rate among the elderly is very low, and hospitals have been overwhelmed because mild and even asymptomatic COVID cases must be sent there.
They actually don't need any medical help, but people who are just panicking, they are panicking because there are so many of them, thousands. So we just could not accommodate them in the hospitals.
Hong Kong has trod a middle path between the Western and Chinese approaches to lockdown. Now it seems to have the worst of both worlds and will have to choose one definitively. Chinese President Xi Jinping has made a rare public statement to order that the overriding mission for Hong Kong's leaders is to stabilise the outbreak. That suggests the ultra-strict lockdowns of the mainland may be enforced on the city. As the Western world emerges from the COVID storm, Hong Kong is right in its middle. Tom Cheshire, Sky News, Beijing.
Also making news for you this morning, the NHS and Prostate Cancer UK are launching a nationwide campaign to identify men with prostate cancer amid fears that more than 14,000 cases may have gone undetected since the start of the pandemic. 15-year-old Kamila Valieva is the favourite to win the women's figure skating final at the Winter Olympics today. The Russian was cleared to compete in Beijing despite a failed drugs test. She's currently in first place, but there'll be no medal ceremony if she makes the top three until her case is concluded.
When you're a kid watching the Olympics, you get inspired by what's out there. And now it's, okay, you get inspired by what's out there, but you're also seeing this spectacle that is covering up all of the skating magnificence that could be seen at the Olympics. And it just feels like there's an effect potentially on the next generation of skaters.
Australian police have closed more than a dozen beaches around Sydney after a swimmer was killed in the city's first deadly shark attack in nearly 60 years. A warning that we're about to show you footage of the attack that some viewers may find distressing. Here we go.
Big great white, that's a great white. Oh man, oh no. Oh no.
Emergency services were called to Little Bay Beach after reports of the attack, but paramedics were unable to save the victim, who is yet to be named.
This has been a complete shock for our community. Our coastline is our backyard, and to have a tragic death under such horrifying circumstances is, completely shocking.
It was surreal, sort of like, no idea what happened and why or what. And then little by little it started coming up on the news, and I went back this morning. Malabar's dead. There's not even one person in the water. And I'm certainly not going in for a while.
Conservation charity warning of a growing threat to the global whale population. Here we go. A report from WWF is calling for action by countries to protect so-called whale superhighways used by the mammals. It's a great image, doesn't it, that it conjures? Superhighways for whales, creating them in some of our major oceans. The findings draw on satellite tracking data from 845 whales over the last 30 years and highlight significant threats to their safety, most notably fishing net entanglement. Their chief marine advisor says they must be protected at all costs.
What we've learned is that it's not good just to protect whales in one place where they congregate. You have to protect them the full length of their migration route because they're experiencing threats all along it, and that's kind of shows what the ecosystem function is, because it has to mix in with the globalness of what whales do.
Quick look at the weather here in the UK. It's a bit rougher.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Storm Dudley has moved on, but to the southwest, Storm Eunice is heading in for tonight and Friday. The Met Office has issued warnings for wind and snow through to Friday evening, and there are similar warnings for Ireland. Still quite windy and it's cold for most, with showers running into the north and west. There's some more prolonged snow for the Highlands. The morning looks fine for many, although there'll be showers around.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Here's a video showing the power of the wind during last night's storm. Are you ready? Have a look at these fast-moving clouds against the full moon during Storm Dudley. A beautiful sight if you were willing to brave the elements, or you could watch it through the window. Not so much if you were outside. Lightning bolts have hit an erupting volcano in southern Italy as well. Mount Etna is Europe's highest and most active volcano. The photographer who captured this rare image said he checks the direction of the wind and never gets too close. How about this for your morning walk? The dog walker has been caught in a sandstorm at Portstewart Strand in County Derry. The picture was captured as Storm Dudley hit Northern Ireland yesterday. And what about this for you Thursday morning? A chicken riding a pig. Francisco, apparently the Vietnamese pot-bellied pig, has found a new best pal in battery hen Alice. The 4-year-old was initially given as a micro pig gift to a girl, but grew too big and got rehomed in Lanarkshire. He shares the house with 4 dogs and 60 hens. And having kept chickens for quite a long time, all I would say is all lovely, but whatever you do, when it's bedtime, don't leave them together, otherwise you'll be missing one chicken. Now, in a moment, we'll speak to the head of the University and College Union, Joe Grady, with yet another round of strikes underway. Tomorrow with us in just a moment. First, our top stories for you this morning. Thousands have suffered power outages and many trains remain suspended after Storm Dudley swept across the UK with winds topping more than 100 miles an hour. Bracing ourselves now for Storm Eunice. And hospitals in Hong Kong are struggling to cope with a surge in new COVID cases, with some patients being treated on trolleys in car parks. The US says Russia has moved as many as 7,000 more troops to the border with Ukraine, contradicting Moscow's claim that they were withdrawing some forces. The latest we're hearing is that there's also manoeuvres in the Baltic Sea as we speak. Well, in the last hour, I spoke to the Defence Committee Chair, Tobias Ellwood. He told me the consequences of not preventing a Russia attack would be grave.
I think privately, the international community is regretting not stepping forward. But we still can act. We still can offer a no-fly zone. And critically, this initiative that Britain has put forward, the last time the Prime Minister was here, this alliance between Poland, Ukraine and Britain is something that's very, very important indeed. That needs to be explored as to how we can support the Ukrainian people. If we do nothing and allow an invasion to take place, it will have, I think, a totemic effect on European security. This is a serious moment and we're being tested.
Ben Wallace, tomorrow's here. Ben Wallace, speaking at NATO just at the moment. We'll bring that to our viewers in just a second or two. Thoughts? Good morning.
Morning. Well, Tobias Ellwood says we are being tested, and actually that's the government's message as well. Liz Truss is flying to the region today. She says that Vladimir Putin may hold off on invading, on attacking Ukraine for weeks or months, and this is a test of the West's mettle. Now, Tobias Ellwood takes a different view. He's the chair of the Defence Committee, saying that in the meantime, the West should go further. He had been calling for Western troops to actually enter Ukraine, although that was not a view shared in government, who said that Ukraine are not a member of NATO, therefore that wouldn't be happening. And he says that will be too late now, but we should perhaps look at a no-fly zone of the sort that the West brought in over Libya in 2011. Now, the government's view is that that's not what they're going to do. They're going to bolster the countries on Ukraine's borders, but I think they agree with him that this is a serious test. The route they want to go down is sanctions, and Liz Truss is warning today, she's going to be giving a keynote speech in Eastern Europe today, that Russia faces massive economic consequences. He thinks that that might be actually counterproductive.
OK, let's
sanctions on Russia.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's hear what Ben Wallace has to say.
Well, I think there's quite a lot of, as they say in Russia, vranya going on. You know, I think we have seen the opposite of some of the statements. We've seen an increase of troops over the last 48 hours, up to 7,000. We've seen a bridge constructed from Belarus into Ukraine or near Ukraine. And I think we should, as I've said, we'll take them at their word, but we're going to judge Russia by their actions. And at the moment, the troop build-up continues.
Your build-up continues too. You've just sent more troops, more equipment to Estonia. Isn't that just going to antagonise the Russians at a time when you say you want dialogue?
Not at all. Look, what we're trying to say to Russia is the consequences of this mass build-up, nearly 60% of Russia's land combat forces on the border of a sovereign nation, will get you the opposite effect. In 2014, when you illegally invaded Ukraine and Crimea, you ended up with more troops on your borders, more defence spending throughout NATO. That's what will happen. That's the strategic error that Putin is potentially about to make if he does invade. And I think it's really important that he understands that NATO is completely united on this. We are deadly serious in how we're going to face the threat that is currently being posed to both Ukraine and potentially to our security. And that's why we've been here today and yesterday making sure that we are all in step, which we are, to make sure the message is clear to the Kremlin.
The NATO Secretary General yesterday talked about the biggest crisis in Europe since the end of the Cold War, and that this is a new normal. Is this a new normal, building up troops on either side and facing each other off?
Well, I think what is certainly becoming tragically normal is the Kremlin using malign activity and threats to try and get its way. And we've seen that both in the physical invasion of Crimea and the occupation of that part of Ukraine. We've seen that right now with 150,000 plus troops on the border of a sovereign state. That is not normal in anybody else's book. Of course, NATO has to respond to that. Of course, Europe has to respond to that. This is not a joke or a light matter. This is a real challenge to the stability of Europe. And one of the ways we can make sure there is no overspill or escalation is to provide resilience to our partners at NATO, and that's what we're all doing. Anybody else?
Taking them at their word, judging them by their actions.
That's right. And the clear message from the NATO Secretary General, from our government, from the US government is that what Russia says in terms of showing us those pictures of tanks withdrawing does not accord with what's happening on the ground. They see evidence of a military build-up, as we can saw from some of those satellite pictures, and that's what we should be looking at. Interesting crunch point might come on Sunday, the 20th, Kay, when Russia had said that its military exercises in Belarus, where part of the troop build-up would come to an end. So we'll see if that makes any difference.
OK, tomorrow, thank you. Tomorrow's Take at 9 o'clock.
See you then.
Thank you. Now, more than 50,000 staff at universities across the country are on strike once again in a long-running dispute over pensions, pay and working conditions. 10 days of strike action kicked off on Monday. Joined by Joe Grady, the General Secretary of the University and College Union, which represents more than 120,000 academic staff. Hello to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. Tell us about the action being taken.
Yeah, so as you said, there's strike action this week, and as of Monday, staff at 68 universities will be taking strike action, and this is over pay, which has fallen by 20% in the last 12 years. It's about a 35% cut to staff's guaranteed pension. But it's also, as you said, about working conditions. So we are seeing an absolute explosion of workloads at universities. Recent reports suggest half of staff are showing signs of probable depression, but we've also seen institutions making serious misuse of zero-hour contracts. We've got over 66,000 staff on some form of casualised or atypical contract, and this is increasing. And of course, all of this is against the fact that inflation has soared by 7.8%. There is a huge cost of living crisis. Staff have moved heaven and earth throughout this pandemic to do everything they can for students. And it's so disappointing we're back here, but staff deserve so much better.
How many universities have been affected, and what's the mood?
So this week there's 44. Next week, because the pay dispute will kick in as well, it's 68. The mood on picket lines is, I think, as it always is, frustrated, upbeat despite the terrible weather that we've had, and also staff and students standing firmly together. 73% of students support the strikes. I've been visiting picket lines in Glasgow and Yorkshire and London, and people are just as determined as ever, because this isn't a sector that is cash strapped. If we look at the total income across the sector last year, it was 41.9 billion. It has reserves of 46.8 billion. This is a strategic decision that university managers are taking. So nobody wants to be on the picket lines, but it's certainly not a defeated attitude.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on the programme. Well, hundreds of thousands of students are being impacted, as you can imagine, by the strikes. Let's hear from one of them, Harry Baldwin, a third-year student at the University of York. Hi, Harry, what are you reading?
Hi, to be honest, students at the moment are just quite angry, they're quite disappointed, and they feel like they're being taken for a ride almost. You know, we've been facing such large amounts of disruption now for a long period of time with the strikes, the COVID pandemic, and we're disappointed by it all, of course.
What impact is it having on you?
Well, we're missing out on large amounts of learning, but also the personal element as well. So back in December, when the strikes were announced, my assessments were brought forward for the strikes, and my nan was very unfortunately unwell in hospital. And I contacted one of my university lecturers who I said, you know, is it possible if I were to go home and see my nan? And unfortunately, she never got back to me, and I had to do my assessments a week early, and I never saw my nan again. So it is having a very big personal impact at the moment on students.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That's terrible. The impact on online learning as opposed to in-person learning for you?
I think it's not the same whatsoever. You know, we're expected to pay the same amount in tuition, and we're not getting the same service whatsoever from it. But one thing I really want to mention here is I think there's an alternative method to striking here. So Joe was talking about picket lines and university lecturers and academics going out on strike. Well, actually, there's an alternative method they could be pursuing, which would reduce disruption to students. So I was talking to one of the UCU members yesterday, and they were saying to me, one of the alternative strike methods is to reduce research for the university, which would impact their financial cost to the university, as well as reducing grant applications, which would have a financial implication to the university while reducing the disruption to university students. And I think that would be a better option to be pursued by the union.
From your perspective, how much support is there for this series of strikes, which will increase still further next week?
I don't think there's that much support whatsoever. You know, I've spoken to a lot of university students across the last few days about this, and they're just fed up and they're tired of it all. You know, since being a third-year student myself, we've faced 2.5 years of strikes now. We've faced a COVID pandemic. We've gone through so much. We've missed out so much of our learning. And I just feel like there could be so much more done in order to help university students out during this situation.
What is it that you're studying?
So I'm studying social and political sciences. So a large amount of my lecturers are currently striking, unfortunately. But one thing that really irritates me is quite a few of them have actually taken down their online resources. So I'm unable to use those during my during the strike break or the strike recess.
That's annoying. What are you hoping to do career-wise once you leave university?
Well, I'm quite fortunate. I've been offered a grad job already compared to quite a lot of other people. So I'm moving to Scotland in a few months. So I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, can you tell us what you're going to do?
So I'll be working for CGI as a business graduate.
Oh, show off. Good for you. Fantastic. I hope that you managed to get this sorted and that you managed to finish your studies in a timely fashion. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. All the best. Thank you very much.
You too. Thank you, young man. And let's speak now to the Shadow International Trade Secretary, Nick Thomas Simmons. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us. Just a quick thought on that while we've got you. I know that you can turn your hand to anything. Do the lecturers striking have your support?
Well, firstly, Kay, it's great to join you this morning, and good morning to you. With regard to the situation at our universities, I would just urge everybody concerned to get round the table and to find a solution. Of course, nobody wants to see a situation where people go out on strike, whether it's the people going on strike themselves, the managers in our universities, or indeed the students. I think our university sector has been through an extraordinarily difficult period in the pandemic. Students, staff facing enormous challenges. I just very much hope that a solution to this can be found so that staff can resume their work and students can resume their education.
Is the government doing enough as far as money laundering is concerned, as it's been described by the people who are British? They've got a British passport, but they are either dual nationality or originally from Russia?
The government is not doing enough, and there are a number of promises the government has made to look at issues, and it simply hasn't done it. So the so-called golden visas, for example, where if people show they have millions to invest in the United Kingdom, they are simply allowed in without those checks. The government has been looking at that issue, I think, for the best part of 4 years now and hasn't actually acted upon it. The government has been promising an economic crime bill. Then we hear that it isn't necessarily coming forward in this parliamentary session, because we need to see reform, we need to see transparency. So, for example, we have Companies House that quite rightly registers companies, but we've got companies that are what are called shell companies. They're companies within companies. We don't actually know who the beneficial owners are. And we need to be doing more too to crack down on the laundromat of dirty money that exists in this country. There are huge amounts the government should be doing, and they should be doing it now.
Talk to me about your reaction to this research that we've been seeing from the British Chambers of Commerce surveying 1,000 businesses. And they are saying only 1 in 8 said that the Brexit trade deal was helping their business.
Yes, and over 70% were raising problems with the trade and cooperation agreement. And the reality is that this government is not making Brexit work, and it needs to do 2 absolutely critical things. Firstly, it needs to look at making pragmatic changes to the trade and cooperation agreement itself that will make it easier for our businesses to import and export up and down the country. But second, what is really crucial from that British Chambers of Commerce research, and indeed from when I've spoken to exporters too, is the government just isn't providing the support that's required. That research from the British Chambers of Commerce shows that the businesses most affected are small and medium-sized businesses with 250 employees or less who don't have the resources to go out and employ trade advisors. So when the government is actually looking at the changes coming in, so we had additional customs checks, for example, come in on New Year's Day this year, the government needs to step up and provide support to businesses to be able to adjust. At the moment, the government is just standing on the sidelines and not giving our exporters the support they need.
They're certainly focusing on what's happening as far as COVID is concerned, and it does look as though whatever COVID restrictions are left in place, they could be scrapped completely by the end of this month, most certainly, if not before then, including these free lateral flow tests. Is that a good idea?
No, that's the wrong decision at the wrong time. The government should not be scrapping the free lateral flow tests. They are extraordinarily useful and important. What if, for example, you have people who are going to visit a vulnerable elderly relative, perhaps even visiting someone in a care home, perhaps visiting someone who has an underlying condition? The use of those lateral flow tests is absolutely crucial. And I think the government is making a profound mistake in taking away the free availability of those tests.
OK. Just looking at, I saw images there of people having lateral flows. Of course, that's what so many of us are used to doing. Do you not feel that, you know, it is time now for us to get back to normal, which is what the government is saying? And even if you do have a positive test, in all likelihood, you won't have to self-isolate going forward.
Well, what I want to see on the issue of the self-isolation rules is the actual evidence that the government is using to support that decision. Parliament will be sitting again next week. I hope the government will put that evidence forward. Of course, we want to see restrictions disappear on our lives. We all want to see that. We all want to move on. We've had this 2 years of incredible disruption and sacrifice, but trust is so low in this Prime Minister that we have to see a transparent decision-making process where we can see the reasons these decisions are made, because the worry with this Prime Minister at the moment, doing anything and everything to save his own job, is he's appeasing his own backbenchers and not taking decisions based on the science. Let's actually see the science and the evidence the decision is based on. I think that will assist everyone with trust going forward.
Good to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you. Quick look at the weather for you.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Storm Dudley has moved through, but the southwest storm Eunice is heading in for tonight and for Friday. The Met Office has issued warnings for wind and snow through to Friday evening, and there are similar warnings for Ireland. Still quite windy out there today, so be careful if you're heading out and about.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
So obviously with all that wind around, the last place you want to be is on an aeroplane, isn't it, trying to come in to land. Look away now if you have a fear of flying. Oof, spare a thought for the pilot and crew from the Northwest Regiment of the National Police Air Service coming in to land. A very bumpy flight during Storm Dudley, as you can see. It may look scary, but the service says safety is their top priority and wouldn't fly if it wasn't safe. There are wind limits for takeoff and landing, but not once airborne. If you've ever been on an aeroplane as it's trying to land in the middle of a wind, a storm, then you probably won't want to do it again, trust me.